Hello, all. Welcome to another episode of Shake Pods. Today we have with us Paul. So, Paul and we recently met at an event where he was giving a talk about very interesting thing on how we can use causal statistics to predict and solve or understand some of macroeconomic geopolitical problems, which was pretty interesting. And then we had a long talk about this subject on AI and how is there any way that we can bridge causal statistics into AI. And I kind of bugged him too much in the event and didn't let him eat his falafel. So I apologize for that. But Paul has held a lot of leadership positions in pharma companies, in drug discovery companies. He was head of AI, director of data science, and right now he is chief scientific officer in Bayesian. So seems like a super cool title. When I heard about CSO, most of the times I think it as chief security officer because I am from IT background and most of CSOs are chief security officers, but then chief scientific officer is something pretty new to me. Tell us a bit more about that.
Okay, excellent. Yes, as said, I'm the CSO at Bayezian, a small AI consultancy in London here. Now, I think what we see there is you'll see this title CSO with a lot of biotechs, a lot of these small medical companies in there, and that in many ways underlies the idea that we are pressing the science here. We're doing things for the first time, and also that we're bridging areas as well too. That it is not just a question of biology, it is not a question of AI. It's a way of being able to map between those domains. In the case of Bayesian, what I am there for is a very necessary glue between the AI and the biological world. What is it that the biologists are going to need? What could they use in there? What is it that AI could achieve for them? So very much a sort of a bridging a communication role. If you look towards your biotechs doing drug discovery and things like that, I think in a way there are analogous roles in there. That your CSO in there is supposed to understand all the different scientific angles and the commercial angles and the business angles and meld them all together and say, okay, how can we develop these drugs? How can we do discovery, the scientific process in a way that fits out with business objectives?
So you have a PhD in computer science and genetics.
I do.
So were you always interested in biology and genetics? And computer science and genetics seem two different spectrums. And how did you kind of do it together?
Well, I certainly was always interested in biology, or at least biology was the first science I got interested in. Like a lot of major points in our life, sometimes it's difficult to explain, but I was on a very academic stream in school, but one to which no particular stream spoke to me. Physics, ho-hum. Maths, well, that was kind of interesting. Chemistry, so. And then even biology to a certain extent. But one year I was fortunate enough to get a very good biology teacher. And for some reason, that subject came alive to me. The whole idea of living things, how mysterious, how complex they are, and trying to solve the problems around them. And, of course, this reflects a lot of the problems that we have as well, the problems of our ecology, the problems of medicine, having the problems of understanding evolution. And so it just seemed like a magical subject to me there. So biology was my first love. What happened as far as computer science was concerned was that there was a time when biologists, scientists, and things like that, it was all very much just about biology. Having that sort of bit of math skills, those computer skills were things that people just didn't have. But it started to creep in slowly. And I happened to be there at that point. And almost because I had no choice, because someone had to do it, I ended up doing a postgraduate qualifier in computer science, because I also thought it would also be a good fallback as well, in case I couldn't get work. And my PhD supervisor at the time was astute enough to say, this is going to be vitally important in the years coming forward. As
Mhm.
having these two skills or this group of skills combining them together is the way that the future is going to go. And he predicted it a decade or two before it happened.
Yeah. I think having that skills or edge over, if you are a pure biologist, then I think having an edge of computer science is always a better in terms of job market or opportunities or as a complete professional. And also I think having that ability to code always helps, I guess. But
Always.
then as a biologist, what was your primary programming language?
Oh, wow. You are taking me way, way back. I think the first one was Pascal, which I think it is still possible to program in, and I did, and this is slightly embarrassing. I did a whole bunch of small little applications in Visual Basic, which, they were not the most complicated, high performance computation things in the world, but they did useful tasks. They manipulated data for people. They visualized data for people. They're very useful. My PhD was done in C++, and I will be glad never to return to that ever again. But day to
Yeah.
day, mostly what I use is Python. 80%
Yeah.
of everything is in Python, like most of the world.
Yeah. I mean, I think everyone are so obsessed about building cool things, and sometimes we just forget that the application or the things that you are building should be useful. So I think we are all like obsessed with the new things, cool things and everything, and forget that is it useful to the customer itself. So I don't think you should be embarrassed about building simple things which solve the problems at all.
No, I think absolutely. Like, so I agree with you 100%. Last year, I read an essay that was entitled, "We Need More Smart People Doing Boring Things," where, as you said, everyone going after these incredibly glamorous, sexy targets, these amazing things. But the author of this essay pointed out that one of the most profitable biotech companies in North America it's called New England Biolabs. You might never have heard it, but basically they supply the reagents, the petri dishes, the cell cultures, and everything to every lab functioning in North America. It's one of the most profitable companies in the world, and they found themselves a boring niche, and they execute in that well, and they are vital to the ecosystem. And I think not just biology, but other industries, if you can be astute enough to find what's that angle, what's that thing that everyone else thinks is just a bit too boring to do well,
Yeah.
and find it and execute on it well, you could make yourself quite a life, quite a career.
True, true. Yeah, completely agree with that. So you described yourself as a lab coat wearing biologist, and now you're building AI and data systems. So tell me about the transition. Was there a flip of switch, or it happened gradually?
I think a bit between. I'll tell you the story where I was a lab coat wearing, bench dwelling scientist. I grew things in flasks. I peered at things through microscopes. And, to make it clear, I loved that work. It's a great thing to work with your hands every day like that. So crafting experiments, running things, getting things to work. I think it must be almost like woodwork, something like that. Other people, but there are two issues with that, and one is that in the end you will become the greatest craftsman in the workshop there, but it does not lead to a career in itself. Just being good at lab work. And the second thing is that all of this biology, all of this actually physically manipulating organisms and things like that is very dicey. It's very random. Things don't work, things like that. And I had a bunch of failed experiments and things were not looking great. And I was looking around thinking, what's my backup plan in there? And that was when this computation thing came along. And I said, I thought at least this could always be a backup career. And I got into it, and it turned out that my timing was just perfect in there. Now, I always imagined that I would keep a foot in the lab or so, but the force and the need for those skills was so great that once I crossed that boundary, I was gone in there. And I think what you'll actually find is that in the maybe not so long ago, maybe 15 years ago, many biologists were still at that lab bench there, still doing experiments, still working very directly with things. And maybe 20% of them were doing computational tasks. And now it's flipped. I think
Yeah.
where we've shifted down to maybe there are only 20% pure lab bench people now. And this makes sense. It used to be that the data was hard to get, but now the data is easy to get. We've commoditized the data. We can sequence people's genomes. We can order antibodies on the web, things like that. So what do we do with them? What do we do with that data? So our attention is shifted further along that stream of investigation. And so I've been drawn along with it. I still think of myself as a biologist. I solve biological problems. It's just that I happen to do them with math, with stats, and with computers.
So if you have to pick one, which one would you pick? Always biology?
I think honestly, it probably always would be biology in there. If I had to, if you said to me, no more biology or no more computers, I think I probably would stick with the biology because that is the kingdom, that is the mystery that just keeps raising questions that there is no end to in there. It's the one in which I still have the unique advantage, the unique edge, whereas, everyone's doing AI now, of course.
For sure. Yeah. So you talked about experimentation, right? As a biologist, now getting data is easy and data has been commoditized and everything. So how hard is experimentation in the biologist setup when compared to a data science experiment?
Okay. I think actually the biologist has a very tough path, a very tough set of tasks ahead of them. Someone once joked that physicists and mathematicians tend to be optimists and biologists tend to be pessimists. And one of the reasons for that is that physicists and mathematicians, and by extension, computer scientists, can control everything in their experimental setup, in their investigations. Whereas the biologist, these things we work with, bacteria, cells, things like that, are still often very mysterious. Every biologist who's done experimentation has always had these stories of there was the experiment that would never work and then suddenly it did, but we don't know why. There's a little bit of magic, there's a little bit of superstition. People sometimes they'd have lucky pieces of clothes they'd wear to their experiments to make sure that they work. I think our depth of knowledge and our ability to control them in biology mean that experimentation is much more difficult, and that even when we get a result, we have to very much think of it in the context. What cells do we use? What reagents do we use? Is there another way we could have accidentally created that result in there? It is very difficult to lock all those variables down. And maybe that's one of the reasons why our biological knowledge is so partial, actually.
Okay, makes sense. So in the event we met, you gave a talk about causal statistics. So for our audience who do not know causal statistics, what is causal statistics and why should we care about causal statistics in the world of creation, AI generation and everything? Why should we care about causal statistics in itself?
Okay. So let's think about the world, the wonderful world that we have at the moment, which AI can tell us so many different things and so forth. And, of course, it's amazing what AI can do as well, but it is still fundamentally associative. It is still fundamentally correlational. That is, that it says these two things appear together. So therefore, ta-da, that's our conclusion. So, even if you look at LLMs, all they are is essentially saying, what is the likely next token that has come along in this string? It says, this goes with that, this goes with that. And that turns out to be a very powerful model in there. That's gotten us a very long way. Where we run into problems is, I think, on two axes there. Number one is if we want to know why that thing is happening. So, say, for instance, some people, I saw this particular paper today, someone was saying, they've assembled this massive data set of cancer cells using a lot of immunological data, a lot of cellular data, things like that. And they said, You can look through this massive data set that took years to gather, and you can still not understand why a cancer is occurring.
Mhm.
You can sort of give a probability to a cancer occurring. You can make some predictions as to how the cancer will occur, but you don't understand mechanically why it's happening. And that's a problem,
Okay.
obviously. And the other thing is that, in complex systems, we can have many things interacting. And if we do not capture or understand how those things interact, we're sort of in a position of ignorance there. Let me give an example to you. So during COVID, you might remember a lot of people were saying, take vitamin D. Take
Yeah.
vitamin D, it's good for you. Because they'd found out that COVID patients very often had very low vitamin D levels. And that seems very logical. An association, that's a correlation. That's something that an AI would spot. But what it actually, when you look under the hood, when you investigate a bit further, is you find out that COVID patients have low levels of vitamin D because sick people usually have low
Yeah.
levels of vitamin D. It's not that the low level of vitamin D causes or exposes them to COVID, or that a high level of vitamin D will protect you against COVID. So we need to understand mechanisms in there to understand the confounders, the things that obscure what is actually going on in these systems.
So everyone talks about how AI is
Hmm.
black box models and explainability stuff and so on and so forth. Do you think we can use causal statistics to improve the explainability?
I think absolutely. There's a very interesting model or framework by Frank Harrell, famous biostatistician, who said that you can think about any predictive model on two axes. And one of the axes is power, and the other of the axes is interpretability or explainability. And he says, usually there is a trade off in there. As a model becomes more powerful, it becomes more difficult to actually see what it's doing in there. So okay, if we are going to deploy AI systems into healthcare, into hospitals, the things like that, you would be aware there's even regulations that patients have the right to know why certain decisions have been made about their healthcare. What do we do with an AI system where we don't understand what it's doing in there? So this is where we can start to bring causal models in there. And in fact, a lot of the advances in recent years have been from melding machine learning and causality in there.
Mhm.
Very tough causal models that previously would have been very difficult to solve statistically. We can now solve them relatively easily with AI and with machine learning in there. And I think that knocks down a lot of barriers that worry people about AI. Why has this decision been made? Is this decision equitable? Is this decision correct? If we use causality, we've got this better view on the mechanics of those models. And so we can deploy them with more confidence, which is critical, as you would be aware, in regulated industries or in industries where we're dealing with people's sensitive personal data.
Where would causal statistics go, right? So, in an AI application, let's say a simple AI application, let's say a RAG application, which kind of takes data and you augment that data with the prompt and then you give it to LLM and then LLM gives some output X. So, where would causal statistics fit? Does it fit after the output or before the output? How does it work?
See, I would think of it as working in an adjacent way with some caveats, as I'll come in a moment. I think of causal analysis as being like experiments that we do explicitly
Mhm.
in there. So, very often in sales or in data science, you'll do an A/B experiment, something like that,
Yeah.
and if you're doing a clinical trial for a drug, that is basically an experiment. You're saying this or that, to test your outcome, to test your drug, to say, does this intervention have this effect that I desire? So it's adjacent to the LLM world in there. So if we were to do a causal experiment, we would say we're doing it for a drug and for something like that. We would say, okay, let's have all the factors involving this drug and this patient in there. how they interact in this model, and then let's gather the data from patients in this trial. Let's feed it into this model and let's solve for the causality in there. Now, these models can be quite complicated in there, and you would have seen that piece of work that I presented in that talk where we first met. There's some very interesting work there from a company called 51 Folds, who are essentially using LLMs to construct causal models. You talk to the LLM about your problem, your concern. It uses data sources, it interrogates the web, it uses a RAG, and it assembles a causal model for you. And it says, do you think that's your problem? And I think that makes these tools a lot more accessible in there, because we can have these many brilliant, incredible, exciting tools in there. But if we can't apply them to real problems, we can't connect them to the problems of people who are trying to work things out, what good is it?
Causal statistics and causal inference has been there for a while now. And I think machine learning, deep learning, generative AI have blown up in the past few years. AI models size increasing day by day, its capabilities increasing day by day. Do you think for the explainability, especially in regulated industries, do you think industries will use more causal statistics now, or are they using a lot more now since
That's,
AI?
that's interesting, actually. I think causality has been hanging around for a long time. And I know I've spoken with several colleagues of mine we all had the same reaction. This seems interesting, but we're not quite sure how to deploy it, how to actually put it into action there. So I think causality probably has a few more years before it comes into these regulated industries, because we have to think about how we're going to use it appropriately, how we can gather the data for it, how we get it into a regulated space. AI, Gen AI, and things like that are going through that journey themselves at the moment. And it's a difficult question. How do you deal with hallucinations when you're talking about people's health? How do you deal with the fact that your answer might not be the same the next time you ask it? If you're talking about, drug discovery or advising people which drugs to prioritize and which ones to stop developing. But we are slowly coming around to a set of what I think are acceptable frameworks for those. People showing ways to validate, people using evals and guardrails and things like that. So these systems will never be perfect, but they will be imperfect to an acceptable degree. And that to me seems like the sensible way to do anything. Humans make mistakes, computers can make mistakes as well, as long as they make mistakes to a degree that we're comfortable with and that we can accept and that we understand, that's all right.
Right. Right. Yeah, makes sense. So are you solving any new problems, new cool problems in the event? You mentioned about a geopolitical problem that was going on. I think it's not relevant now. It might be, but I guess it might be.
That's right. Well, this was one of the things that intrigued me straight up, and this is involving the 51 Folds were the first people who, almost the first time I'd seen anyone consider these sort of problems. So, to fill in the audience, this was a talk I gave a few more weeks back, and the question was, when will the Strait of Hormuz open? Now, this is obviously a critical question that we all want to know. And there are people who are in shipping and logistics that want that question answered. There are people in investment markets who want that answer. There are people who are dealing in politics who want that answer. One of these brilliant solutions at then where they said, well, okay, let's model this situation in there. So, you might see an output which is Gates of Hormuz open in 1 month in there. What are the things that could possibly affect that? Well, one of the things that could possibly affect that was, what's the American military commitment into the Gulf in there? One of the other things is obviously the political stance, the Iranian government, which in turn could be shaped by the attitude and the unrest of their people, population. It could be shaped by the stance of China. Are they going to bring in pressure in there? All of those things could be shaped by what are the effect of sanctions in there. So we have this large, dense network of entities or interactions in there. You can put these in one of these Bayesian causal models, and you can come up with an answer saying, there's approximately a 60% chance that the gates of Hormuz will be open within a month. Crazily enough, it does seem maybe that might be tending towards being correct right
Mhm.
now.
Yeah.
But I think this is it's an important example, and it's an important sort of phrasing of the type of question we can look at rather than sitting a couple of experts down and asking their opinion. You can actually say, let's quantify this in there. And we can have all these factors in there. And in a sense, we don't care how it happens. All we want to know is what happens at the ends. So is the strait open or is it not in there? And that, I think, is a huge win for many, many industries in there. If we can do geopolitical, we could also kind of shift it over to social questions in there, psychological questions. I mean, let alone all the questions that we could ask in biology for this particular purpose. Just this last week, actually, I was using a similar purpose to try and work out what could possibly cause people to have arthritis attacks.
Mhm.
What are the things that possibly interact in there, and how, therefore, might we be able to predict arthritis attacks to get people to adjust their medication or adjust their activity and so forth. It allows us to cope with an uncertain world there and even kind of uncertain data to an extent.
Right. So, what kind of problems would be best to solve with causal statistics? Is it predictive problems or prescriptive problems or preventive problems? I mean, so for example, like if you want to find a solution or before the event happens, if you want to prevent from the event happening, do you think causal will work there? Or for predictive
Hmm.
problems or after an event happened, what could be the whole reason or cause of it and how can we avoid or mitigate it in the future? So which kind of problems are best to solve with causal statistics?
Okay. Well, you touch on a good point there, because something that troubles me, particularly in the context of medical problems, is the idea of preventative problems. And this is a long understood issue in medical systems that if you get good enough at predicting that there's going to be a problem, you will change the behavior of the system. So, for example, let's actually take my example of predicting arthritis attacks in there. You know, if we become good enough at predicting people's arthritis attacks and getting them to change their behavior, then we are actually shifting the data in the system. And where our data space has migrated, now we've got a population of people who are actually avoiding arthritis attacks, and our ability to predict those attacks will actually fall. How do we cope with that? That is a very difficult problem in
Mhm.
there. So I don't want to say that's a sort of problem that we should avoid, but it's a problem that's difficult. And I think you can think about all sorts of equivalent problems in the sort of psychological social sphere as well. If you're looking to change people's behavior and you're successful, well, then what do you do? You've got a different population then, and your question has shifted. The thing that I think that causal analysis is very good for is this sort of postmortem. What happened and why did it happen? Our predictions can't affect the system. So therefore, we've got a very clean sheet. We're not interfering with the system that we're looking at. And so, biological investigation is going to classically be that. A drug trial is going to very classically be that if we apply our causal statistics on that after the fact. Okay, we've got this whole bunch of patients here. and some of them took the drug, and we got this whole bunch of different results. And so let's feed in all the different things in there, including the patient's behavior and the different insights, the different hospitals the patients were at, some of the patient's background, and even the patient's adherence to the medication program, which often turns out to be a huge thing. Put all these things into model, and so we can dissect it away and we can see the true effect in there, rather than the effect that's been confounded and confused by all these random factors that is going on.
Right, right. How difficult is it to change someone's behavior on the findings? As a scientist, you run these models and causal analysis, and then you find an answer or reasonably good answer saying that this is what is causing. And then how difficult is it to change the behavior habit of the patient itself once you find it?
Or to change anyone's behavior. Look, I think this is the great problem of the data scientist, isn't it? That, everyone's got stories of having done an analysis, having done a test and things like that, and going to show one, and then it's just ignored. No one pays attention. It is the same in research, it is the same in drugs as in everywhere else. I think it's got a lot to do with the culture of your organization in there. And of course, we can't control that completely. But I think what we can do is we should try and get closer to the stakeholders, and we should try and get closer to the problems in there. And that when we give our explanations and when we give our answers, we should not show up with a matrix. We should not show up with a SHAP diagram or something like that. We should translate it to their terms, okay, and put it in terms they can understand.
So, as a CSO, as a Chief Scientific Officer, how much AI do you use on a daily basis?
Oh God, sometimes it seems the only thing we do is AI, which I think is not good. I mean, even for an AI consultancy as it is, because I do very strongly feel one of the lessons I've taken away of my career is that you do not want to confuse means with ends. You do not want to confuse tools with what your actual job is. And so very often, and it's not just with AI, this has happened very often with several biological and scientific technologies. People get obsessed about the minutiae and the differences of those tools in there. And I think in a sense, the best thing is almost if they become irrelevant. They're just something that you use to achieve your outcomes in there. So I would say at the moment, they dominate my work. I hope as time goes on and as technology improves as well too, almost they become less important. They're just a thing that works for us, and that to me is an ideal tool. I don't have to think about it. When I catch a bus, I don't demand to see the bus driver's license and check the wheels of the vehicle and what brand of bus it is and so forth. I just catch the bus because it works. And that for me, that's a perfect piece of technology.
Right. Super interesting what you said. How does that dynamic work? I mean, how can you change, or now you're saying that you're too reliant on AI or AI tools? It seems like the AI capabilities is going to increase day by day. So do you think we can eliminate AI or reduce the importance of AI in our work?
I don't think we want to eliminate it or reduce the importance, but it just feels a matter of how we use it. As I said, several times in my career, I've gotten involved in particular technologies. You find yourself all of a sudden, you're spending all day keeping a particular piece of software running, tweaking it, endlessly configuring it, things like that, and so forth. And that to me, that's not a good situation. It's not actually helping you do your jobs. So to me, I think AI is going to be there. It's going to increasingly be there, but it's going to change the form in which it is presented to us. Let me give you an example. So when you write yourself a Microsoft Word document or something like that, you use the spell checker, you use the grammar checker, or maybe it suggests it automatically for you and you don't think twice about it. That's just a thing that you use. It's a capability of the piece of software in there. But increasingly, of course, now those things are being driven by AI, and the grammar is being checked by AI and so forth. Do you care that it's AI? No, you don't. All you do care is that like it produces a well-spelt grammatical document for you. And
Right.
to me, I feel that's more of what we need in
Right.
there. Or if you look, say, at the difference between Chat GPT and Claude in there, where Chat GPT is not entirely, but very much it's the chat box and
Yeah.
you're going to interact with it and things like that. Anthropic and Claude have gone very much in on tools in
Yeah.
there. Use Claude Design if you're making a PowerPoint deck. Use Claude Code if you're actually doing some coding in there. Use Claude Co-work if you've got some irritating repeating task in there. And all those tools are still very obviously AI.
Yeah.
They've come to you with they're a bit more task oriented
Right.
in there. So, when I, in 5 years' time or whatever, sit down at my computer to say, analyze a set of genes, I don't expect there to be a chat box there that I'll
Right.
have to explain to it saying, I'm going to analyze this set of genes there. I'm going to open up my genetic analysis program and there will be AI running in the background, but I will kind of not notice it. It will do the things that I want it to do, and I don't have to explain myself or coax it along. It also seems to me it's a much more bounded guardrails sort of process as well, too. That we have these tools that are focused towards very specific purposes. And so that's going to reduce hallucinations and weird behaviors in there.
Makes sense. So, at what stage is AI in drug discovery, clinical trials, etc.? And what's the road looking like for AI in drug discovery?
Wow. Okay. This is a big question in
Mhm.
there. All right. If you're asking me for a one-word answer, is there a future for AI in drug discovery? I would say to you, yes. And
Okay.
if you allowed me a second word, I would say yes in
But
there. I think the pharmaceutical industry, like many other industries, has this tendency to jump on board the latest bandwagon, expect it to solve everything, and I've seen multiple waves of this where they pick up particular technology or approach or things like that. And like, this is going to be the thing that solves all our problems. And AI is the latest one in there. Just because there's an incredible amount of hype, bad judgment, and wild speculation and everything like that, doesn't mean that it isn't going to be profoundly useful. We have our first couple of waves of what they call AI designed drugs, and I'm going to give you a couple of quotes there, AI designed, because no one can really quite agree on what AI designed means. Does that mean the computer did it entirely? It means that there was an AI tool used along the way? And you'll probably guess my sympathies there from what I said about tools. I don't care. It just has to do the job. Now, what has happened is that we've had a bunch of those drugs go into clinical trials. None of them have made it out onto the market as yet, but they have done very well in phase one of clinical trials. There are 3 phases for clinical trials. They've done very well in phase one. However, on phase two, they've basically nosedived back to the fairly typical level for all other drugs in there, which is disappointing. And I think means we can expect this behavior to continue into phase three. But let's be realistic about that. If they've done really well in phase one, that's still something. That's still an advance. And I feel maybe the way to put this to say is that it's going to be an evolution, not a revolution in there. That rather than, you'll hear all these bold statements of people saying that we're going to, rather than it being $2 billion in 12 years to develop a drug, we're going to slash that time. And I don't think we're going to slash that time, but I think we could maybe reduce it by 10%, 20%.
Okay.
And that is still a great advance in there. I think our main danger there is actually the head of Anthropic, Dario Amodei, pointed this out. He said, what if it becomes so easy to develop a drug or a drug candidate that we end up with a lot of these cheap, junky drugs that we can't test properly. So pre-trial, preclinical, we just have AI machines grinding out drug after drug after a drug and so forth. They're far more than we have the capability to test. What happens then? And this echoes something that someone said to me years ago. They said, look, it's no good giving me 100 AI designed drugs and saying test them. I can't test 100. I can test 5 good ones. So there, I think, is the question. Don't give me AI drugs, AI designed drugs. Give me good AI designed drugs. And I think that's the gap we're struggling with at the moment. AI can certainly design a drug. Can it design a good drug? We've still got to learn that.
And how can AI design good drugs? Are there any metrics or parameters that AI can follow or broadly to design good drugs?
Okay, absolutely. Look, in many different ways, AI, and I think maybe this is another failure slightly on the part of the field where people have said that AI can help us, but designing a drug is a very long, complicated process. And the idea would be, it isn't that AI can help us like in one particular way. It can help us in 100 different ways. So let us say, for example, that we're dealing with particular drugs are antibodies, okay? Monoclonal antibodies, they're used against cancer, they're used in various drugs against infectious disease, so on and so forth. But these things have to be designed in there. It is very, very absolutely realistically the case of someone sitting down and tweaking a model, a molecule, a protein repeatedly until it behaves the right way, it has the right shape, it has the right properties in there.
Right.
It's a very arduous process. This is a perfect thing to give across to a computer, of course, where the computer can start with a protein structure that's approximately correct. It's somewhere in the neighborhood. It can make a couple of changes to it, predict which ones are likely to be beneficial. It doesn't have to be perfect, okay? It just has to do it faster and make better guesses than a human. Now, we can actually make some of those suggestions. We can send them to the lab. We can test them. We get the results. We send them back to the computer. The computer goes, okay, we'll make a few more changes. And so you get this loop of production in there. And that production line, this whole kind of lab in a box there, that can run 24 hours a day. You have successfully industrialized antibody construction there. It's just an amazing idea in there. It's like you've turned it into a commodity at that point. Of course, there are complexities, and of course, there will still be the need for humans to intervene on it, so forth, because the AI hasn't captured everything in there. But it's a much more robust, scalable, and industrial system than what existed before.
Right. Yeah. Makes sense. Makes sense. So you are a co-founder of Bioinformatics London. Talk to us about that. And you have been running this for over 10 years now.
Right.
Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And what is it about and why is community building important?
Well, yeah. So let me just sort of set the scene for people. So 10 years, more than 10 years ago, we had this whole bunch of people like myself who, we used computers with biology in different ways. We all had different job titles: bioinformaticians, computational biologists, biostatistician, health data scientists, blah, 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 blah. But I think we all existed in the same sort of psychological environment there. We were very much the technical guy. You'd be sitting in a lab of people who were all, very smart in their own ways, but we were the technical guy, the computer guy, things like that. And no one really understood what it was that we did. It all seemed a little bit magical. And I think as a result, a lot of people felt very isolated in there. It was, frankly, in times, it was not a great job to have. You had to do everything in that particular area there. It wasn't a great job for actually like knowing what the right thing to do was either, because you had no one to talk to, so forth. So my co-founders, they were astute enough to suggest, they said, people need a place to talk to each other. And in fact, one of my co-founders, Nathan, said, man, people just want to have a drink and complain about their jobs. and let's not diminish the value of that, right? And so it started up. We started up Bioinformatics London, and it took a while to work out the formula, but the formula was that we would get a talk from some sort. Someone would give a talk, and it would be generally accessible to everyone. My idea of a good talk is something that you go in and you think, well, I didn't know that before. Maybe that might be useful for me when you go out. And afterwards, we will go to the pub and we will talk about it. People will complain about their jobs. People will talk about the gossip in the market and so forth. And so we got this increasingly strong returning audience coming back and again. People saying, they looked forward to it. It was in their calendar. They wanted to meet other people that were like them. And, I think not just from the psychological angle, but I think it helps you do better work. You get this view of the wider world out there. You get an idea of what other people are doing, and it makes your world a little bit bigger and gives you bigger opportunities as well. So we've had companies formed out of it. We've had people get jobs. We've had people change careers, go in different directions from there. It's corny, but we're stronger together. We're stronger if we learn from each other in there.
Right. Makes sense. Good work.
Okay.
So, what's the next thing that you are most excited about? Are you working on something, anything?
Well, I am. And, I mean, I've mentioned already is predicting arthritis attacks. And I think that whole thing starts to become more interesting as we gradually digitize our world around us, and people will be wearing devices on their wrist that we can get data off and things like that. So that's very exciting as well. But, in a way, I'm also just really excited about this new era of drug discovery in there, because it feels in a way as if we might be shifting from it being an art to it being more of an industry, a process in there that we can control. And, this is not insulting anyone that went before, but, famously drug discovery is a very hit and miss thing. It's a casino economy. For every 1,000 potential drugs that is suggested, only one of them makes to market. What if we could make it like 2 in 1,000 or 3 in 1,000? That would be incredible. And I think we don't have that solved. We don't have panaceas, but we have things that are starting to fall out now. My favorite word there, commoditize. We're commoditizing part of that process so we can use our creativity. We can use our brains for the more creative, the difficult parts of that equation there. And that can't help but make things better.
Got it. Makes sense. So to wrap this up, we'll just have a fun rapid fire round, which I'll require you to answer as short as possible. Okay. Best advice for a biologist who wants to learn to code in one line.
Just get started. There's nothing stopping you. There's nothing special about it. Just get started.
Claude, ChatGPT, or Gemini, your favorite?
Claude, far and away.
Will AI replace data scientists? Yes or no?
AI is going to replace some data scientists, not all of them.
One book every scientist should read.
Wow. David White, On the Sea of Work. It's all about careers and losing hope.
One skill every scientist needs to have in 2026.
Communication, all the time, every time. You got to know to talk to people, even if you're a genius.
AI for drug discovery. Is it there yet?
Well, like I said before, yes, but.
Best career advice you ever got?
Agency. You have to look out for yourself. You're the best person to take actions of yourself. You're the best person to know what it is that you want.
Okay. The next thing that you want to learn?
Wow, the next thing that I want to learn. You know what? I really would dearly like to get into longitudinal modeling and time series, get a better grip on that.
In 2026, the people who win the AI era in biology will do dash.
They're the ones who are actually solving problems and not just building AI systems and not just posting on LinkedIn about it. They're the ones who are actually like finding molecules.
And finally, one thing you tell your lab coat wearing younger self.
Wow. Okay. This is going to be a bit longer, but I would tell him not to be so afraid and not so worried that, problems will come up, but he will solve them and he will fall down and he will get up and he will keep going. And I think that's advice for us all. In a long enough life and a long enough career, things are going to go wrong, and you just dust yourself up and stand up and you get back in the ring.
All right. Great. Great answers. It was
Okay.
lovely talking to you. I have learned a lot from this conversation. I'm pretty sure our community will also. It's super interesting what you have delivered in the talk that I've attended on whatever we have talked right now. Any events, any more talks that you are giving in the future,
Well,
please, I'll be happy to attend.
Bioinformatics London is always there on the web for people to chase up. So please do if you're in that space.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much, Paul. It was nice talking to you today.
A pleasure too, sir. You too.